Hello and welcome to BattleTech Faction Briefings. Today, we return to the periphery for the first time in a long time. This time we are exploring a unit from the Magistracy of Canopus. They are one of the most battle-hardened units of their nation. They are pirate hunters, and they have need of more tech staff. Today, we are discussing the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers. There are two emblems for the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers. The brigade emblem is 3 gold diamonds set upon a cloak above a blood-stained saber. The regimental emblem for the 3rd is a circus ringleader holding a bull by the horns placed atop the Roman numeral 3. It is an odd symbol, but it makes their tenacity very clear. Their unit colors are green and gold, which are the same colors for the rest of their brigade. It is a simple and striking color scheme that still has some camouflage value. The story of the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers ties into the history of the Magistracy of Canopus. To skip spoilers, go to the time listed. The Canopian Fusiliers were created in the early days of the Magistracy of Canopus. With the establishment of the nation in 2530, it wasn't long before more planets joined and a military would be needed for defense. There would be 3 regiments of the Fusiliers by the dawn of the Reunification Wars in 2577. At the time of the war, the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers were stationed on Pavond. They would be moved around alongside other units as distractions to ensure the SLDF could not conduct a focused attack upon the MAF. The first major operation for the 3rd was on Tarma in the Free Worlds League. The SLDF were using it as a staging area for the invasion forces. The troops guarding the supply base were underprepared, and the raid was successful. This and other raids on supply bases completely threw off the SLDF, forcing them to change their strategy. The SLDF troops would pull back to reorganize their offensive. This bought the Magistracy 6 months to rebuild their forces and solidify their defenses. The 3rd would be stationed on Hastur in 2579 after their successful raid on Tarma. In 2581, the 2nd and 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would be teamed up as defense for Finardir. They would face the 60th SLDF Brigade with the 403rd Independent Regiment, 3rd Orloff Grenadiers, and 1st Defenders of Andurian. The 2 Fusilier units would hit the SLDF regiment hard, then leave the world before an effective counterattack could be mounted. This would save the strength of their forces for later battles. The former base world of the 3rd, Pavond, would be captured by the SLDF in 2579, but they would deal with guerrilla attacks for years. Thus, the 3rd would raid Pavond in 2582 to help the guerrillas. This raid was a success, and would give the guerrillas the boost they needed to keep the war going. Their final battle would be on Canopus 4, when the SLDF came to capture the capital of the Magistracy. The 3rd would work alongside 5 other BattleMech regiments in 2584. The battle lasted 4 weeks, and the MAF would face 3-1 odds, yet they would fight hard against the invaders. In early May, the defenders were destroyed or captured, but the unconquered worlds would still keep fighting for a few years. The entirety of the MAF would be destroyed or forced to disband by 2588. The 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would no longer be a unit for almost 2 centuries. However, the Magistracy of Canopus would start secretly rebuilding their army, and by 2765, the Canopian Fusiliers would be rebuilt, including a new 4th Regiment. However, the 4th Regiment would not last very long. The 3rd would be training on Tarl 4 prior to the start of the New Vandenberg Uprising. As the rebellion spread, the 2nd and 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would team up with 2 other units on a mission to destroy the 219th BattleMech Division of the SLDF. They would win after a long and bloody battle. Strangely, the soldiers of the 3rd would not be proud of this victory. Between the Periphery Uprising and the Ameris Civil War, the SLDF became less of a threat, and the MAF would no longer have to be a well-kept secret. The 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would continue to garrison Terrell 4. They would rebuild from the uprising and remain as a garrison force. By 28-21, they would be down to 35% effective as they held off attacks from pirates and other threats. By 28-30, the 3rd would move from a lightweight unit to a medium-weight unit as they built up using salvage. They would be at 58% effective just as hostilities started up again in the Inner Sphere. As they guarded the Magistracy, they would get whittled down and be at 28% effective by the end of the war, as their defense and raiding missions took their toll. The 3rd would get a new assignment in the early days of the war. They would be moved to Marantha in order to hold off pirate attacks and do punitive strikes against the Taurian Concordat. This would be their main focus for over 100 years. While they would not get involved in the Fourth Succession War, like previous wars, they would join the rest of the MAF on the assault into the Capellan Confederation in 3030. However, by this time, the 3rd were downgraded to a green skill unit. Thus, they were assigned to capture Gunthar, a mercenary guarded world that the MAF believed would be an easy win. They arrived in November 3030, and upon arrival, Major Wilhelm Archal would contact the Defenders of the World to bribe them into leaving. However, unlike the low-tier mercenaries he had fought in the periphery, the 15th Drakon were of SLDF origin, and took the bribe as a personal insult. As a result, the 15th Drakon conducted a surprise night attack. They would destroy a company of deactivated mechs and destroy several supplies before the 3rd's dropships could open fire to drive off the enraged mercenaries. Due to the loss of supplies, Major Archal would shift to defensive tactics, as the 15th Drakon, who only had 2 battalions, did the same, both assuming they could wear down the other through small-scale raids. Major Archal was sure that reinforcements would soon arrive to give him the needed boost to finish off the mercenaries. This would lead to a 2-year-long stalemate, with the 15th Drakon trying to coax the 3rd from their defenses, and the 3rd doing small raids to wear down their enemy. No reinforcements arrived, and the very slow battle would drag on. News of Capellan victories in the war would rally both sides, as the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would get desperate, and the 15th Drakon would have the morale boost they needed to fight back. By June of 3032, the MAF would recall several units as the war turned in favor of the Capellan Confederation. The 3rd would attempt an evacuation, but the 15th would strike in order to teach them one final lesson. The 15th Drakon would capture 2 dropships. Meanwhile, the 3rd would try to cram as much as they could into their remaining dropships, then destroy what they couldn't bring with them. By early July, the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would leave Gunthar in disgrace. They would return to their base world of Marantha in order to recover and rebuild. The 3rd would remain on Marantha as they rebuilt. Major Archal would be demoted to XO, and a new commander would be brought in to attempt to strengthen the unit. The 3rd would continue their defensive work and occasional counter raids. However, in 3057, there was a growth in pirate attacks on the Magistracy of Canopus. This would lead to what would be called the Pirates' War. In reality, this was a Word of Blake plot. The Marian hegemony would work with the Word of Blake due to the amount of weapons and tech they brought into the hegemony. A sect of the Word of Blake would manipulate the leadership of the hegemony into doing a covert invasion of the Magistracy, due to paranoia over the Magistracy making alliances with other nations. The 3rd Canopian Fusiliers had plenty of experience dealing with pirates, and would become a core unit in defending the Magistracy. They would work alongside the Canopian Highlanders. Several worlds would be attacked and defended during this war. These included Theraxa, Polydix, Tarl IV, Marantha, Vixen, and Gambilon. The unofficial war would come to an end after the Word of Blake involvement was revealed. Still, the efforts of the 3rd in fighting off pirate raids would lead to the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers becoming one of the most respected units in the MAF. Their reputation would also make them a requested unit to assist the CCAF in the Capellan St. Ives War. They would be sent to Milos in 3060. They would face the 2nd St. Ives Lancers in March 3061 and deal heavy damage to the Lancers. After the fighting, they were moved to Nashuar, as the Iridani Light Horse moved in to garrison Milos as the new peacekeepers. on Nashwar, they helped the 1st Makiran's Armored Cavalry Regiment take the world. The 3rd would take major damage in this battle and lose an entire battalion. They would be given supplies and troops by the Confederation in order to quickly rebuild. As the Capellan St. Ives War continued, the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would join the attack on St. Ives in 3062. The fighting would be fierce, but they would capture the world for the Capellan Confederation. After the battle, the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would take some time to rebuild. They would get transferred to Denbar in 3063, where they would use Capellan tech and troops to rebuild. This more closely tied them to the Confederation, as the 3rd Battalion would be made up of Capellan troops. There would be some trouble at this time with the armored forces not getting enough supplies to rebuild, and the infantry forces not being allowed to go to Menke to train with the infantry of Makiran's armored cavalry, whom they had grown close with over the course of the fighting. In 3065, the dependents of the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would be moved to Denbar to be with the troops. This would be done to end the complaints coming from the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers. Blakist attacks would drive the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers off Denbar. They would flee to Cyan and quickly be integrated into the defenses of the world. They would battle against the 17th Division and Dragon's Breath mercenaries in 3070. The 17th would be defeated and leave the world, but the intelligence they gathered in the fighting helped the Blakists plan the second invasion of Cyan. As for the Dragon's Breath, they were almost completely wiped out. The various defenders of Cyan kept the world safe, but at a high cost for many of the units. In 3074, the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers were still stationed on Cyan as defense. Their skills would again be put to the test as the Word of Blake attacked. The Blake forces would be made up of the 8th Division, 24th Division, Warrior House White Tiger, and Warrior House Rakshasa. The battle would be more chaotic, as Warrior House White Tiger would turn on Warrior House Rakshasa when they attacked the Celestial Palace. The 8th would move in to quell the Tigers. However, due to this infighting, the Capellan forces had an advantage and would ravage the 8th and 24th, and Warrior House Rakshasa would fall to Warrior House White Tiger. After Cyan was secure, the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would move back to the Magistracy of Canopus to assist in defending their homeland from Blake attacks. The 3rd were given orders to hunt the 41st Shadow Division. Thus, they divided into battalion-sized units to find the elusive enemy force. However, the 41st would eventually leave Canopian territory and return to garrison Gibson prior to 3079. To keep the Magistracy safe from further attacks, the 3 battalions of the 3rd were sent to garrison 3 different worlds. They would build up the defenses of Candy Ear, Cremari, and Joys. Their work was so good that the later garrison forces would use the defense facilities and training methods of the 3rd. By 3079, the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers were down to 65% effective due to all the fighting that they had endured. The battalions of the 3rd would again be used to garrison different worlds for the Magistracy to build up further defenses. By 3085, they would be garrisoning Brixtana, Trip, and Early Dawn. They would build up defenses and face no real threats. Later, they would be split and moved to Techne's Revenge and Cremari, where they again faced no notable challenges. As the years passed, the quality of the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers would decline due to only playing defense. By 3145, they nearly lacked any officers with combat experience. Thus, a plan was set to move them to the Duchy of Endurian in 3149 for further training and to potentially gain battle experience. However, an attack by the Mirian hegemony in 3150 would disrupt these plans. The invaders would seize the worlds of Gambalon and Marantha. The 3rd would be sent in as part of the counter-invasion. They would be teamed up with the 1st Canopian Brigade and the 1st Magistracy Highlanders. Together, they took back the worlds in about a month's time. With real combat experience and a new era ahead, the future of the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers seems bright. This is where their history concludes, for now. The 3rd Canopian Fusiliers have a very long history, and despite being disbanded during the Star League era, they were brought back together and stayed strong for centuries. Their skill level has varied, but their reputation for raids and pirate hunting is a point of pride. They had many victories, and helped keep the Magistracy of Canopus safe from various threats. Hopefully they can build up to a powerful unit once again. There is almost no information about the skilled warriors of the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers. Wilhelm Archal. He was the commander in the late Third Succession War. The unit had been reduced to green skill level, and after his failure on Gunthar, their status did not improve. He would eventually be demoted and replaced prior to 3050, where he would become the XO of the unit, but attempt to make underworld contacts in hopes of regaining some power. William Sangray. He would take over as the commander prior to 3050. His improved training methods, and the missions the team accepted, would help build up the 3rd to elite skill level. He would keep the unit fighting until near the end of the Word of Blake War, where they would transition back to garrison forces. He would retire some point after 3085. Alida Salgado. She would be the commander in the Dark Age. She would be in charge of a green skill unit and would have to face the Mirian hegemony despite having no combat experience. The victories against the hegemony have boosted the 3rd skill, and, more importantly, their commander's confidence. Connie Gemin. She was the commander of the armor forces during the 3060s. She would perform well, but after the fighting, she could not get replacement equipment from the MAF. This led to tensions, but she kept the team ready to fight, even in the Dark Age. When choosing mechs for periphery forces, there are some odd options. However, the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers are notable for having many Capellan mechs, and some ages-old SLDF units. They use all the salvage they can find, which gives them a higher tech status, but they tend to lack the tech staff necessary to take advantage of their plunder. This shifted as they got support from the Capellan Confederation in the 3060s. They would have 90% advanced tech by 3064. By the end of the Word of Blake War, they would be fully upgraded. This would make them the most advanced unit in the MAF for a time. The 3rd have infantry and armor. The infantry are noted to have been part of this unit for centuries, but the armor was introduced around the mid-31st century. Both teams worked well with the mech forces and allied forces. The infantry is noted for building a friendship with the infantry of McKieran's armored cavalry. The Fusiliers as a whole are not considered a high-ranking unit in the MAF. Yet, they have more combat experience in most eras than the high-ranked units. Their success comes from their adaptable tactics, where they adjust to the enemy in order to exploit any weaknesses they can find. They may not win every battle, but against the right opponent, they are nearly unstoppable. Their victories against pirates, St. Ives, and the Word of Blake clearly show their skill and use of the technology they have access to, whether it is broken or new. There is no fiction about the 3rd Canopian Fusiliers. Also, there aren't that many sourcebooks that cover the unit beyond the periphery-focused books. The vast majority of sourcebooks only have location and formation data. Despite that, they have quite a bit of noted history. This was a fun briefing to cover. I generally like the periphery, thus learning about periphery regiments is quite enjoyable. When I covered the Battle of Gunthar, it gave me the excuse I needed to do a magistracy of Canopus Regiment. The biggest issue I faced was the lack of information about periphery forces. Many books have a few paragraphs, but not much more than that. Still, I am grateful that I was able to cover a lesser known, but very interesting, periphery mech force. It is hard to recommend painting up a set of Canopian Fusiliers. This is due to the limited role they play in the history of BattleTech. Granted, if you don't care about historical matchups, then they work great as periphery representation on the tabletop. If you have painted up a set of Canopian Fusiliers, please let me know in the comments. Next time, I will be exploring the Mirian hegemony with the 6th Legio. After that, I will be doing my secret summer project. Here's another hint for those of you who want to guess what comes next. Beyond that, I want to give a big thank you to everyone who has been watching. You keep me going even when the summer heat makes me want to quit. May your weapons stay hot and your reactors stay cool. Until next time, please check out the other videos on my playlist. And remember, I'll see you at the tavern.